Once a month, Paula Pant, host of the Afford Anything podcast, answers voicemail questions the listeners send in. Here's one now.
Hello, Paula. My name is Richard Kennedy. I live in California, and I love your podcast and your website. I have a question for you about what you did when you returned from traveling. I'm in a position now where I can either build a large travel fund or a fund to invest in real estate for the first time. I really love to travel, while I'm young and everything, but I also know that if I can set up a real estate income or passive income, I might be able to travel anyway. So I'm wondering, what did you do when you came back from traveling for the first time? How did you take those steps from not having any money to investing in real estate? And what would you suggest to someone who has the opportunity to start one or the other? Thank you, Paula. Have a great day.
Thanks for the question, Richard. It's funny. Your specific question is, what did I do? But what I hear you really asking is, what should you do? So let me pause here. Let me back up and add some context for the listeners who might be wondering, wait a second, travel, passive income, what's he talking about? Here's the background to that question. About a dozen years ago, in 2005, I graduated from college. I really wanted to go travel, but I didn't have the money. I was a fresh college graduate. So I went into the workforce. I worked for 3 years. I had a starting salary of $21,000 a year. At the time that I finished my 3-year career, I had gotten a promotion. I was making $31,000 a year. So that was the most that I've ever earned at salary W-2 income. I saved. I lived like a Scrooge. I saved a lot while I was working. Most of those savings came from freelancing that I did during the evenings and weekends. So whenever I had some time off from work, I would write freelance articles for magazines and websites. I would save every penny of that after taxes. And after 3 years of doing that, I had saved $25,000. And so in 2008, I quit my crappy job with my $31,000 salary and just flew to Egypt. I got a one-way plane ticket to Egypt and kind of went from there and putzed around, did a whole lot of nothing, and learned an incredible amount. It was one of the most life-changing experiences of my life. That's redundant. But it was fantastic. A lot of people think that traveling is nothing more than sightseeing, but sightseeing gets really old. I mean, there's nothing meaningful about just standing in front of an object taking a selfie. Of course, back in 2008, that was before the selfies. That was before selfies were invented. Dude, it was even before Kindles were invented. That's a different story for another day. My point is, the years that I spent traveling changed me in ways that I never could have imagined. And Afford Anything, the website, the podcast, none of this would be here today if it weren't for the fact that I had done that. So on the surface, it might have seemed stupid to leave a career. I used to be a newspaper reporter, and quitting a newspaper job in 2008 was just like the dumbest thing in the world that you could. I mean, it was career suicide, right? Because there's no way, virtually no way I was ever going to get a job in newspapers or possibly even journalism again. Everybody told me not to quit. They told me that your 20s are a great time to be saving money and investing, putting that money into index funds and just really building a solid financial future and building your career. I mean, that was the advice that I got from everyone. And I said no, I turned my back on all of it because I, like you, Richard, I wanted to travel while I was young. And in hindsight, the urgency to travel while young was actually incredibly misguided because you can travel at any age. 20s, 30s, 70s, 80s. My parents are in India right now. I mean, my parents are 75 years old. They're still traveling. They went to Panama last year. They went to Russia a couple years ago. They've done all of this in their 70s. So there isn't actually any urgency to traveling while you're young. But that being said, I would encourage you to travel at all decades of life because you yourself are going to be different and the world is going to be different. Remember that earlier kind of casual comment that I made about the fact that when I traveled, selfies weren't a thing, the Kindle wasn't a thing. So if I wanted to read, which I did, of course, because I'm a nerd, I carried around books in the English language. I would carry these into remote places in a backpack. and I would rip the covers off of the books in order to reduce the weight of those books in my backpack. And as I was reading the books, I'd like rip pages out in order to reduce weight and leave more space in the pack. And I have that story. I have that experience. I know what it was like because I traveled before smartphones were ubiquitous. And traveling now is very different. And that's just the difference between, 2008 to 2017. It's just a difference of less than 10 years. Imagine how different the world will be when we're all traveling with glasses that have AI that translate foreign languages so that when we look at a sign, we can read it, even if it's written in Korean or Japanese. We have that technology already, but imagine what will happen soon when it becomes more ubiquitous. Imagine what will happen when augmented reality and AI just change the way that we travel. It's almost unthinkable. So our world is going to change, and you yourself are going to change. You're going to have different priorities and interests. I would encourage not just you, Richard, but everybody listening to travel at all stages of life, no matter how old you are, and no matter what decade we're in, because the experience will be fresh and new and different every time. And sometimes it doesn't seem like it makes financial sense to do so. But if you have the savings, so do not go into debt for it, if you have the savings to be able to travel, and you can build that at almost any income if you're willing to have a side hustle and spend your evenings and weekends making extra cash and putting it all into a savings account. Like almost anybody is able to do this if you live in the United States or a similarly free first world country. And particularly if you get paid in US dollars or a similarly strong international currency. Almost anybody has the ability to have these experiences. And even though they might not seem to make financial sense on the surface, inspiration may or may not strike. I mean, for me, inspiration struck. And I remember the moment that I thought of the name Afford Anything. I was in Bali at the time. I remember that exact moment. Here we are, 6 years after I've started Afford Anything. This is now what I do full time. It's much, much more lucrative than the dead-end newspaper job that I had beforehand. The people who said that I was committing career suicide were wrong. When they said that I would never get another job at newspapers again, they were totally right. I never did get another job, but my career has improved in ways that I could not have imagined, just as the world will change in ways that we cannot imagine. And that is the benefit of traveling, and it's not something that you can quantify. It's not something there's no ROI on it, but there's no... Geez, at the risk of sounding like a Hallmark card, there's no ROI on life. Okay, excuse me while I vomit. Blah! Now, this is all a long tangent to your original question, which is what did I do when I came back? So to answer that question directly, when I came back to the United States, it was 2010. I knew that I did not want to get a job. I didn't want to work a W-2 salaried, sit in bumper-to-bumper traffic in a crappy commute, like the kind that many of you who are listening to this podcast are probably in right now. I didn't want to do that, and I didn't know how I was going to not. I just knew that I wouldn't. So I had the skills and, more importantly, the confidence from that side hustle of freelancing. I had the confidence to believe that I could strike out on my own and become a full-time freelance writer. And so that's what I did. Starting in 2010, I became a full-time freelance writer, and in the beginning, it was very slow. I remember when I landed my first client, and they paid $800 a month. And for how excited I was, you would have thought it was $8 million a month. And it snowballed from there. But the first few months were incredibly lean and hungry and stressful. But eventually, one client leads to the next, word of mouth spreads. And I built up a solid 6-figure income as a freelance writer. Then I saved that money because I was just used to living cheaply. And frankly, once you've traveled the world and you see people with leprosy, yet leprosy still exists. Actually, a significant number of people are affected by it. Once you see things like that, living in a tiny apartment with low ceilings doesn't seem like such a big deal. Cooking dinner at home rather than going to a restaurant, #not a big deal. Because at the risk of sounding callous, a lot of middle class to upper middle class people in first world countries who complain that they don't have the same luxuries as the upper middle class. It's like you're in the global top 5% complaining that you're not in the global top 1%. I realize that relatively it feels significant to you, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of that, but sometimes it's hard to break out the victim violin when you see how much better off you are than the vast majority of the globe. It's one thing to sit at a computer and read about those lessons, but it's another to actually be in Cambodia face to face with somebody who survived the Pol Pot regime and really internalize that lesson. So anyway, wow, this is like tangent after tangent, like ping, ping, ping. I have the attention span of a cat. So Richard, to answer your question, what did I do when I got back? I became a full-time freelance writer. I lived really frugally. As a result, I built a large gap between what I brought in and what I spent. And so that gap is what we refer to as savings. I took that gap and I bought my first rental property with it. And that first rental property was a triplex. Moved into one unit with roommates, rented out the other two, and then lather, rinse, repeat. I just kept doing that. I bought a bunch of single-family homes after, not a bunch. I bought like a total of 4 other single-family homes. So now I've got a total of 7 rental units, and the cash flow that they kick off is totally sufficient to cover my cost of living at, a reasonable middle-class lifestyle in a location that has a reasonable cost of living. I live in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada. So that's what I did. I put my lifestyle first, and I didn't delay building passive income. So here's where we get to the question, what did I do? And what I think you're really asking is, what should you do? And I guess I can't tell you what you should do because that depends on your priorities. But I would encourage you not. It's difficult to say this because on one hand, I want to say, don't delay a tomorrow that may never arrive. You never know what's going to happen. You might get sick. You might get hit by a car. Anything could happen. And you don't want to be living so much for the future that you forego the present moment. I realize that sounds funny coming from somebody who hosts a podcast that's more or less dedicated to saving and investing, which on the surface seems to be the art of delaying gratification. But have you heard of this thing? It's called the marshmallow test. And it's this famous study in which a bunch of young children were given marshmallows, and they were told that they could either eat one, I may be misquoting the details, but it was something to the effect of, they were told that they could either eat one marshmallow now, or if they waited 15 minutes, they could have 2 marshmallows later. And that's one of those tests in which you measure a person's ability to delay gratification. And they found that the kids who were willing to delay their marshmallow eating by 15 minutes later in life were also more successful because they had the ability to delay gratification. But the other part of that study, the part that nobody talks about, is that the kids still ate 2 marshmallows after 15 minutes. They didn't wait for 6 hours to have 8 marshmallows, or for 10 years to own a marshmallow factory. And that's the part of the equation that I don't think we're talking about enough. So, TLDR, which I know doesn't make any sense, but I'm going to say it anyway. TLDR, I encourage people to retire both early and often. And what I mean by that is bake mini retirements into your life while you're on the road to an early retirement or financial independence. That way you get a little bit of both. You still have those mini retirements, those sabbaticals that you're enjoying in the present moment so that, you can travel while you're young and while you're middle-aged and while you're old and while you're every age. And also you can build to financial independence concurrently. So I guess I'm telling you to have your cake and eat it too. And wow, I've just weaved a whole bunch of metaphors and analogies and cliches together into one giant confusion soup. So, Richard, I hope you got something out of that. But the takeaway here is enjoy mini retirements while you're on the road to financial independence or while you're on the road to early retirement. I hope that helps. Enjoy your travels. And call back sometime. Let me know how it goes. Let me know what you decided to do. Thanks again, Richard, for asking that question.
Hey, did you enjoy this excerpt from the Afford Anything podcast? Then click to download our free ebook, Escape. You'll be taken to a page where you can enter your email for immediate access to everything you need to know about escaping the 9-to-5 grind to live life on your terms. And you can also subscribe with one simple click to get alerted when new videos are uploaded.